Welcome, everyone. And so anyhow, okay. So sitting here in this room in Vancouver, the most livable place in the universe.
Thank you.
It is hard to imagine the revolutionary changes the world is going through. My purpose in this short presentation is to give you a sense of the dynamics of a global process that will lead to either world war or a new, just, economic world order of development for everybody. So I'll start with something that happened in 1858. There was a second debate that was going on between Abraham Lincoln and in a Senate race and Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas wanted to trap Lincoln by alleging that Lincoln wanted social equality for blacks. And knowing that the audience did not believe that blacks should ever have social equality. And Lincoln said, in return, that, well, I will grant you that blacks are socially inferior, but no one has the right to rob anybody of the fruits of their labor. And so that's the issue. Slavery is theft. That was the issue. Not social this, social that. I reference this because the slave system back then was part of an international slave system called the British Empire and its junior European partners. And that system was based on drug trafficking, slavery, gunboats, feudal aristocrats, serfs, the British East India Company control of India. And that system was challenged in the Civil War in the United States and later on. Now, unfortunately, today we have come back to the same system of slavery. It's based on something called debt. And we call it debt slavery. It's not individual slavery, but the slavery of entire nations. And at the core of this system of debt slavery is something called currency speculation. Christ called them the money changers. Now, after World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt determined that this kind of currency speculation would not control the world. And he forced, in a big fight, something in a conference that took place in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, what became known as the Bretton Woods system, which was based on a fixed exchange system between nations. So you couldn't have currency speculation. However, that system collapsed in August of 1971, and eventually a new system emerged by 1973 called the floating exchange system. That's the system we've been in since 1973. Another name for the floating exchange system is the floating slavery system. Now, out of that system, a new currency emerged that was an international currency of the dollar. And then later, another currency like it emerged called the euro. And these currencies were the currencies required to have access to raw materials, to have access to finished products, to be able to function. And then all the other currencies would then be manipulated against these currencies. Just to give you a sense of this, before 1971, 75% of all currency transactions involving the dollar, that's when there was a fixed exchange system, 75% of the currency transactions were connected to the actual exchange of physical goods. Today, it is less than 1%. Less than 1% of the transactions that occur in currency speculation on a global scale have anything to do with anything physical, with any trade. Nations that could not defend their currencies were soon plundered beyond belief. Such nations had to go into debt they could never pay. And the debt that kept expanding as they were forced to cut and cut and cut and drive their populations into starvation and misery. Nations that could defend their currencies had to curtail their development in order to deploy massive reserves to protect their currencies. Reserves which would otherwise have gone to their internal development. The investment bankers and the hedge funds at the core of speculation, which eventually included all commodities, eventually all assets, bonds, real estate, and eventually even things that weren't assets like derivatives, these individuals became the super wealthy, like George Soros. The political movement you see here, which also exists in the United States, it exists throughout Latin America, it exists in Europe, with friends in every part of the world, has its origins back in the 1970s in a struggle to get nations and groups of nations to break with this system of slavery as it was expanding, as it was being imposed. And I won't go into all the details of that. That's the whole history. Eventually, it all collapsed in 2007 and 2008. However, instead of the people running the system going under and going bankrupt, they had so much power that they could induce governments to come to their rescue and bail them out. That's how much power had accumulated in the hands of these speculators. At that time, 2007, 2008, this movement began a campaign in the US and also spread to the rest of the world, calling for bank separation, to separate these speculators, these bloodsuckers, from the commercial, from the banking system that people needed to use. Why do we have this million-pound parasite sucking us for nothing? And to end the system of speculation. You'll hear more about Glass-Steagall and its connection to Canada in the next presentation. Finally, most of the world decided they could no longer exist in this global system of debt slavery. It is from this that you have the origins of the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which finally, in July of 2014, began establishing between themselves and all other nations that wish to be a part of it, an end to the system of debt slavery. What does that mean? An end to the system of debt slavery means what? It means my nation can work with another nation. We have facilities to finance the development that we need. We do not have to go into debt to the international banks. We can create our own debt and circulate it as credit. And out of that, we can create the wealth that we need and to give our citizens, our people, a future. So out of the BRICS process and related processes, you have a whole series of major development banks, bigger than the International Monetary Fund, bigger than the World Bank emerging, like the New Development Bank, which the Russians and the Brazilians and many others are now the 5 BRICS nations. And then you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. And there are others coming along. And these development banks are the seed crystal for a vast increase of investment. An investment that Wall Street and the City of London and the World Bank and the IMF will never allow to take off. And those countries that join this and become partners in this can count on the other nations to back them up in any situation in which they are being confronted by Wall Street or the City of London or the military or other aspects of that. And the situation has developed to the point now where the president of China, Xi Jinping, has actually offered the United States to join the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. However, the debt slavery system centered in places like Wall Street and the City of London is terrified that it's all over for them, that their system of slavery is now coming to an end. And they do not want the Canadian population, the U.S. population, any population, to know that this is the issue that defines the existence of humanity. And so you're not hearing about it in the regular media. The nations of Africa, the nations of the rest of Asia, India, the nations of South America are now beginning to orient their foreign policy, their economic policy, their future on this new system. And I have not heard of any major media in Canada or U.S. ever even mention this. They won't mention it. They won't talk about it. This is huge. Instead, Putin is a bad guy. Putin is a new Hitler. Putin is a dictator. That's all you're hearing. China is about to collapse. Xi Jinping is a new Mao. There's a new dictatorship in China. Right? That's all you're hearing. Propaganda. War propaganda. That's what you're hearing. So we now have a war. It is a war. And this war is a system between a system of slavery versus a system of national economic development that promotes the development of all nations. We didn't have a war like this before because this hadn't come into being yet. But now it's a war. And as Lincoln said some time ago, the world cannot, to paraphrase Lincoln, who said, the world cannot be half slave and half free. Now, I will now give you a brief report on 2 battlefronts. In doing so, it is important to understand that this movement has played the seminal, organizing, intellectual role in creating the ideas behind this whole process. And our importance in this is not in numbers, it's in ideas, and it's in whether or not, and what ideas will shape the development to come. So I will go into two battlefronts. The first battlefront is Europe, and the second battlefront is North America. Okay, Putin has said that Ukraine is not the cause of the problem. The situation is not in Ukraine. And what Putin means by that is he's saying, it's not that. It's this war we're talking about. That's the issue. That's what he means. If there wasn't a Ukraine, they would invent a Ukraine. So everything you're hearing about the Ukraine, it's not about that. It's being triggered to break up the BRICS, to stop this process. Similar wars are being prepared in the Caucasus, are being prepared in Central Asia, are being prepared around China, are being prepared around India and around Pakistan, and so forth and so on. This is the alternative to the BRICS. It's an empire of chaos and war. That's what's being unleashed, because once the BRICS take over, once every nation becomes part of the BRICS, that's the end. We don't have a debt slavery system. We don't have an oligarchical system. Humanity has now a potential to deal with its fundamental problems and develop. Now, the Greek situation is a fulcrum or a focal point in this whole situation. Because what happened in Greece was a political party that vowed to the population that they would end Greece's submission to this system, because the system was killing the Greek population. They won the election. They won the election. And what they proposed, they had a modest proposal that the debt be reduced. The European Union, the European bankers, cannot reduce the debt, because the whole system is based on that, speculating on that debt. And if they reduce the debt, then every other country will want to reduce their debt. So you have a huge struggle emerging around Greece. And Greece is saying, not publicly, but they're making it very clear, hey, we can join the BRICS. If you don't change the European system to get us out of this condition, then we can all join the BRICS. And that's what's going on. That's why you have a crisis with Greece. And the leadership of Greece knows the game. They know what the stakes are. They are not politicians. The defense minister is somebody who's spoken at our conferences. The foreign minister is an expert on the BRICS. The finance minister knows exactly what he's doing. Okay? And this is causing tremors throughout the world, the Greek situation. Little Greece. Because the whole system is that way. And the amount of debt created, the amount of financial speculation is so great that you have to now take everything that every country has and bail it out, causing massive inflation or a collapse of the whole system. And so essentially that's where you're at. We're at that point right now. So this issue of Greece is at the center of the war that's going on in Ukraine. But it's not a war in Ukraine, it's a war against the BRICS. Okay, and this is not the place to go into all of that. So now I go into the North American situation, because this is very important. The United States has a president who is fully committed to the debt slavery system. And it has a Republican Congress which is fully committed to the debt slavery system. And it's totally psychotic, calling for arming the Nazis in Ukraine. You know, these Nazis that are, they're not even part of the regular army. You know, these are Nazis, you know. This is giving them arms, just like giving up, it's like giving ISIS arms. I mean, you know, the whole thing is insane. And they're outdoing each other in their vitriol. And they're outdoing each other and pretending that their system is the best system in the world. On the eve of its total disintegration. However, not everyone in the United States is insane, just as not everyone in Europe is insane. And even the British Empire is starting to consider other options in case they lose. And they've agreed to join the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank just now. Of course, they're now doing a little hedge here. The British always hedge. But anyhow, Obama administration went nuts over this. That Britain was appeasing the enemy. Who's the enemy? The Brits. But the British know better. That they're starting to hedge. Now, of course, but they're the center of it. They know exactly what they're doing, and they know that it's possible that they could lose it all, and therefore they want maybe to survive a little bit. It's not clear how this all works, but the important thing is that this war against the BRICS is the war that could lead to nuclear war. Because Russia will not capitulate, China will not capitulate, other nations won't capitulate. Not even Greece is capitulating. So, now the way the system in the United States works is not the way most people think. It's a presidential system. Okay. And the only way you can actually have a voice in national policy is if you run for president. Which is what LaRouche did 8 times. To have a voice in national policy. The only way you can get a discussion going on national policy is to run for president. But who are the candidates that are preparing to run for president? Hillary Clinton, Jeb Bush, there's some other people. Who are they? What are they saying about all of this? None of them are saying anything about all of this. And then in the last few days, a former governor of Maryland, a former mayor of the city of Baltimore, Kevin O'Malley, surfaced in New Hampshire in his presidential campaign. And he said something that is shaking the political establishment. Even though he's not the big name, he said something that's shaking the political establishment. He said, in a press conference, he said, well, one thing that would be to reinstate Glass-Steagall. For 70 years, we prevented banks from gambling with our money and wrecking our economy and running roughshod over the common good that we share as a people and having a stable and good economy. Everybody. I mean, on both sides of the aisle. I mean, so many people say we should do that, and yet it remains undone. And some people in my own party are holding themselves out as promoting some sort of Dodd-Frank light. Oh, we don't want to offend anybody on Wall Street. So let us not talk honestly about how we can rein in this excessive behavior. Now, to say things like that in the United States, and to say it as part of an exploration for a presidential campaign, is significant. Because if issue is not addressed in the pre-presidential period by presidential candidates, it will never be addressed in the United States. That's how you address issues. So it's not about who's going to win the election. It's what is the discussion. That's how the United States works. And if there's no discussion, well, forget it. There won't be a United States. And we might very well be in a nuclear war as a result. Because that country has a lot of nuclear weapons. And they got a crazy president, and they got a bunch of crazy Republicans. So if there's no discussion, you know where it's headed. And our movement is determined that there will be a discussion. And the same goes for Canada. There has to be a discussion on this. Not some, no, we won't talk about it. No, we're not going to talk about that. No, there has to be a discussion. And that's what I'm hoping this meeting and this event will help us get going. And I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and you can get to them after the next presentation. And knowing that the audience did not believe that blacks should ever have social equality. And Lincoln said, in return, that, well, I will grant you that blacks are socially inferior, but no one has the right to rob anybody of the fruits of their labor. And so that's the issue. Slavery is theft. That was the issue. Not social this, social that. I reference this because the slave system back then was part of an international welcome, everyone. And so anyhow, okay. So sitting here in this room in Vancouver, the most livable place in the universe.
Thank you.
It is hard to imagine the revolutionary changes the world is going through. My purpose in this short presentation is to give you a sense of the dynamics of a global process that will lead to either world war called debt. And we call it debt slavery. It's not individual slavery, but the slavery of entire nations. And at the core of this system of debt slavery is something called currency speculation. Christ called them the money changers. Now, after World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt determined that this kind of currency speculation would not control the world. And he forced, in a big fight, something in a conference that took place in 1944 in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, what became known as the slave system, called the British Empire and its junior European partners. And that system was based on drug trafficking, slavery, gunboats, feudal aristocrats, serfs, the British East India Company control of India. And that system was challenged in the Civil War in the United States and later on. Now, unfortunately, today we have come back to the same system of slavery. It's based on something or a new, just economic world order of development for everybody. So I'll start with something that happened in 1858. There was a second debate that was going on between Abraham Lincoln and in a Senate race and Stephen Douglas. And Stephen Douglas wanted to trap Lincoln by alleging that Lincoln wanted social equality for blacks.